UC admissions policies and California Regents decisions on admissions in these very complicated times we're in. Next slide. The laws of affirmative action and UC admissions policy began in 1995, followed in 1996 by a statewide referendum, and it dealt a death blow to UC's ability to admit a diverse class from the university system, which has never fully recovered since that time. UC admitted students through a two-stage process. First, the determination of eligibility using GPA and, in many cases, test scores, then selection by a specific campus or campuses using a comprehensive review. This is all prior to COVID, prior to 2021. Any student who was UC eligible was guaranteed admission to at least one campus, although not necessarily their top choice. Top 9% of students in each participating high school in California were deemed eligible in local context. That meant that the determination was based on the high school GPA and a specific set of courses, without considering test scores at all. In 2019, roughly 32% of California freshmen to UC had earned eligibility in this manner. In addition, the top 9% of students at each statewide were deemed statewide eligible based on an index of test scores and grades. And the individual campuses also had the opportunity to enroll students who were neither eligible in either way, provided they had completed a complement of 8 to G courses, which were specified like 4 years of English, 3 years, or 4 years of math, so on and so forth, had a GPA over 3.0, and submitted a test score. But there was no guarantee that that students would meet this index statewide. Next slide. Criteria at UC was based on many factors. They used college prep courses. There were 15 courses designated that you had to complete. So students hopefully knew this and were taking the right courses. High school grades requirement, we required a 3.0 for residents, 3.4 for non-California residents. ACT with writing or SAT with essay, which were optional, but you needed to take the writing test to be admitted. Academic courses beyond minimum requirements, so if you took more rigorous courses, presumably that was favored for you. Certainly honors and AP courses, the more rigorous courses you took, that was a big factor. High school rank, where the top 9% were guaranteed admissions as long as they took the courses. And then other factors like quality of the senior program, was rigorous, where you're taking a full load. Outstanding performance in more than one subject areas, or work in specialty area like music or art or athletics or some other area. A recent marked improvement in academic performance. Students who had middling grades but really improved the junior and senior year were given an advantage. Special talents again, completion of projects, academic accomplishments or honors or awards, and special circumstances and location of the students, secondary school and residence. Next slide. UC established a standardized testing task force in February of 2019, January 2019 actually, and charged it with addressing the following questions. How well do UC current testing standard testing practices assess high school students for readiness? How well does UC current standardized testing practices predict success? Do standardized testing assessments fairly promote diversity and opportunity? Does UC's use of standardized testing increase or contract the eligibility pool? And they asked for special emphasis or study in 2 areas: de-emphasizing standardized tests or eliminating the testing requirements, should either one be pursued. And finally, should the testing practices at the University of California be improved, changed, or eliminated? Next slide. Well, after a year study, during that year, I can't really talk about all the practices that the task force went through. I know that they called ACT and College Board and ETS to come present evidence and data. And myself and Krista Madden from ACT at the time did go to California, presented our work twice. We've given a lot of questions, a lot of analysis, asked to rerun analysis for UC, specific ways we did that. We provided more data upon request, and we never really heard back from them, but we did present our evidence for 2 sessions for the task force members. The task force then released a report with the consensus recommendations in February of 2020, about 30 to 65 days before COVID really reigned across the country. The recommendations generally encourage the university to consider additional quantitative factors that could supplement grades and tests for eligibility, to expand the pool of students eligible for admissions based on class ranks from current 9% level to maybe 10, 12. They didn't specify, but the idea was that more students would be eligible based on rank. Expand academic support for students admitted that have academic risk, conduct additional research, and develop a new assessment system based on a broader range of skills and attributes, if possible. The task force was asked to investigate two particular alternatives to using admissions tests that were reviewed but not recommended by the group. One was the California office asked the task force to examine making tests optional and the use of the smarter balance assessment in lieu of ACT and SAT. And neither one was recommended by the task force. Next slide. After the task force report, a few activities happened. Of course, COVID, emerged and really conflict with a lot of things, and that's part of what happened. Overall, the task force report recommended maintaining the requirements of ACT and SAT, noting that they did not result in adverse impact. Despite the report, however, the outgoing president, Janet Napolitano, made several recommendations which were approved by the Regents fairly quickly, including going test optional in 21-22, pilot testing test blind in 23-24, and identifying or creating another admissions test that would better align to UC expectations for students. In early 2020s, you probably recall, COVID arose, canceling or disrupting many administrations of SAT and ACT for well over a year. Within a few months of these events, the California Supreme Court issued a preliminary injunction stopping UC system from considering ACT and SAT scores for admissions, in large part due to COVID. During the pandemic, students with disabilities would be adversely impacted about registering for the test. So it was true that students generally, nationally, had a lot of difficulty registering for an SAT and ACT test, depending on where they lived and what the admission cycle was at. Tests were being canceled randomly because of events and widespread outages of COVID, and also testing students in close proximity to each other was difficult. So students with disabilities had particular challenges. UC agreed to a settlement with the plaintiffs in that case that made it the first public system in the nation to stop considering test scores and admissions, scholarship, and financial aid. So UC, beginning in 2021 to this day, is not test optional, but is test blind. And a few weeks after that, California State Universities followed suit. Next slide. Well, test critics who value merit, the alternative to using tests is to rely exclusively on grades. This alternative may work at some institutions, but in very competitive selective institutions, it's a folly. The alternative may sound attractive, but it ignores the large subgroup differences that exist in grades and the impact of selection ratios in admissions. The table above provides an example of difficulties in selection when the applicant to opening ratio is low, as it is in selective institutions. In 2019, for example, when admissions tests were part of the process, nearly 70,000 out of 90,000 applicants to UCLA a high school GPA greater than 3.8. Applicants with a high school GPA of above 4.38 have a 37% probability of being admitted, representing 3/4 of all students admitted to UC. If you have a GPA between 3.8 and 4.38, your probability of being admitted was 6%. And if you had a GPA below 3.8, don't even think of applying, pretty much. The data illustrates that standards for grades and cross-rating are already excessively stringent with holistic admissions processes, where tests are considered. Eliminating the test scores would only increase the pressure on grades and further reduce the probability of getting into school if you ever saw a B in your life. Next slide. Minority representation decreases along the pipeline before testing is even introduced, and that's one of the things the report really emphasized. And this is a table from that report. It shows how the racial mix of students changes at each step as we compare high school seniors to graduates who complete the A&G requirements and so on. So the first column shows the difference between the groups in terms of percent of high school seniors enrolled. The next column just shows the decrease in graduation rates. So Hispanics go from 52% of high school students to 51% of graduates. But now the drop is severe when you look at the courses they've completed. This is the A through G, where you require the science courses, the math courses, the English courses, the social studies courses. And here, rigorous coursework is what keeps many groups and many students outside. So as you can see, for Asian Americans go from a 13.8% of graduates to 20% of students completing the required coursework, whereas underrepresented minorities, their representation goes down. Hispanics were 51% of graduating high school students. They're only 42% with the requirements. African Americans were 5.5% of students who graduated, but only 4% of students who met the requirements. So here you can see the requirements for rigorous coursework has really had a detrimental effect on many students. They could just share percentages. And then you look at the percent that were applicants, which application also has an effect on many groups, and then finally admits. So you can see that it's not the test scores that have a pernicious effect on reducing the enrollment probability of underrepresented groups, but it's also the A through G requirements and also whether or not students apply. Next slide. Focusing on the vertical lines, the percent difference between the disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged groups, the results show that applicants who were either low income, first generation, or especially both were likely to have been admitted nearly similarly to all other groups, with the exception of those who are not low income and not first generation. So the red line at the bottom is probably the one you want to focus on. These are students who may have gone to maybe to the advantage, and their probability of being admitted was slightly lower than other groups in this chart. Next slide. Tests are strongly correlated with income. We know that in fairness, yes, but not reflect bias from task force and from the work that I've done as well. Admissions tests along with high school grades and other indices of academic achievement are correlated with family income. There's nothing new here. Which does not reflect bias in the test necessarily, however. The inescapable fact is that schools in California, like those throughout the country, vary widely in available resources, and students from poor families are more likely to attend schools with fewer resources. The members of board were, and this is a quote from the report, the members of board are well aware that they cannot eliminate the level of the disparate impact of admissions tests have on students from socioeconomic circumstances. The study showed that models combining test scores with GPA explained 14 to 22% of variance in grades for all ethnic groups and 18 to 20% for all incomes. Perhaps counterintuitively, they found that test scores were better predictors for outcomes for underrepresented groups than for majority groups. For students in the lowest income quartile, for example, high school GPA models explain 12% of the variance in freshman grades, while adding SAT to high school grades improves predictability to 20%, which is a fourfold increase. Next slide. In data from 2010 to 2012, 21% of the variance of first year GPA was predicted by SAT scores. This number may sound small, but it translates a lot of differences in outcomes. Models which combine test scores GPA explain up to 22% of the variance in UC grades for all ethnic groups. Indeed, the variance in outcomes explained by test scores increased since 2007, the last comprehensive study, while the variance explained by grades has decreased. Now, many speculate that grade inflation has something to do with this. It could, but certainly the effects of grade inflation have been more pronounced in the past few years according to other research we've seen. And so it's not surprising to see this. One of the, if you look at some of the data, you can see, for example, among students with an SAT score of less than 700, which is fairly low, 11,700, but 37% left the school within a year. Among students with an SAT score above 1,400 on 1,600 scale, about 3% left within a year. So SAT scores, as part of SAT scores, when they're looked at in that way, can have a profound effect not only on grades, but also on retention. Next slide. In this chart, you can compare the models in terms of GPA, SAT scores, and the R2 according to this fact. High school models only explain about 17% of variance in GPA. Adding test scores to the model produces an increase of 20%. In many analyses, SAT scores are converted to ACT scores, so it's not just SAT, even though the report alludes to SAT. There aren't. Next slide. Prior to Bosch studies of these issues, the investigations were whether students with strong grades could be blocked from UC admissions with a low test score, and vice versa. So the concern was that students who had good grades maybe would not be admitted because they had a low test score. Test scores and grades are generally moderately correlated, so that there's a strong enough relationship that it's unusual for students to have discrepant scores and grades. So, for example, of the 18,000 students with SAT scores, one standard deviation below average, only about 300 of those had grades more than one standard deviation above average, and 84% of those students were admitted. And conversely, you can see in the next line that students with high GPAs but low SAT scores were much more likely to be admitted than the converse was true. Grades exert much more influence over admissions decisions at UC test scores do, despite evidence that scores are the best single predictor of success at UC. For example, we did research at both ACT and College Board about discrepancies between students' grades and test scores. We found that about 70% of students have very consistent grades and test scores. Students with high grades have high test scores, low grades have low test scores. That holds true in about 73% of cases. In the remaining 15% of cases, maybe higher, or 50% of cases, test scores significantly higher than grades, 15% of grades are significantly higher than test scores. In this study, it's less so at UC. Next slide. To compare the influence of high school GPA and SAT, I'm sorry, the recipient side, Richard?
Well, it's Elda.
Yeah, that side right there. That's what I want to talk about. To compare the influence of high school GPA and SAT, we place both measures on the same scale. The percent of applicants admitted along each of four dimensions of academic performance. So you can look at students who have a high SAT in the dark blue right up here, and a middle high SAT, middle low SAT, and low SAT. You can see that students who have a high school GPA, if you look at the first row, high school GPA with low SAT score, still have a 84% probability of being admitted. So the low SAT score doesn't seem to displace the probability of admission too greatly. If you look down the first column, however, high SAT, and you look at different GPA levels, high SAT, high GPA, yes, they're 95%, but high SAT, low GPA, less than 50% are going to be admitted. So it does speak to the importance of grades versus test scores in current UC admission policies. Next slide. So what's happening today? Well, today, test optional, test blind is here, and probably to stay, quite frankly. About 1,900 colleges are test optional in 2024, and about 86 are test free, meaning they did not look at test scores even if submitted. The exceptions tend to be in state systems like Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, which do have some requirements for testing. Some military academies, MIT, Georgetown, Purdue. We recently heard about Dartmouth. So the test optional movement was big before COVID, but it really gained 3-4-fold after COVID, quite frankly. And I think it is going to be very hard to displace most schools, possibly because of the affirmative action rulings in the Supreme Court recently, which really make it difficult to defend affirmative action or to use affirmative action in any way, meaningful way. And to use test scores in this kind of a climate makes it very difficult to defend different selection decisions, I believe. Next slide. Most recently, there's been an editorial, an op-ed piece in the New York Times that gained a lot of attention from research that it cites from some economists. The op-ed was by David Lenhart and captured a lot of attention. It focused on research study by Opportunity Insights, which looked at Ivy League colleges and close to Ivy League colleges. The research contends that test scores are helpful in identifying lower-income students and underrepresented minorities who will thrive in college, sort of like the diamond in the rough phenomenon. But that may happen more so at very selective colleges. It may not happen as much at the average or typical colleges. It finds that test scores are better predictor of academic success than grades, and that's something we've known at SAT and ACT, but it's not universal. Overall, if you look across colleges, grades still tend to be better predictors than test scores. But at selective schools, or in particular in STEM majors, the opposite is true, and grades may be second to test scores, quite frankly. Other parts of the process have even larger racial and economic biases they contend. They say that affluent students can participate in expensive activities like music lessons, coaching, travel sports teams. That strengthen their application, they can travel abroad, volunteer in summers. And so many affluent students attend private schools where counselors polish each student's application and essays. So there are advantages to being affluent. Now, they do not really document these in an empirical setting. So while it may purport to what some of us believe or assume, they don't have strong data on this point. I think that's a weakness of them, although I haven't seen much research on this point to begin with. Most measures of life, they also say in America, on income, life expectancy, home ownership, show similar gaps, and we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I do think we're in a different time with admissions, to be honest. Next slide. Tests they found are better than grades, but this is maybe limited to Ivy or highly selective schools or highly selective programs. Affluent applicants, they say, have a private school advantage. Students opting to not submit an SAT or ACT score achieve relatively lower GPAs when they attend an Ivy League college. But students who submit scores and do not submit scores are quite different. So we really can't compare apples and oranges on this factor, I don't believe. High school grades do a poor job of predicting success at Ivy colleges. And again, I think that's true, but I think it's less so at less selective colleges. Students with a perfect high school GPA 4.0 achieve a cumulative GPA in college of less than 0.1 rates higher than students with a 3.2. So again, they're showing that grades, difference in grades of A average versus B average have very little effect on freshman grades in college. Again, that's more likely to be true in Ivy League colleges than less selective schools. Higher scores are associated with higher GPAs. That's true across the board, even when compared to students with different socioeconomic backgrounds, race, and ethnicity. Higher income students have an admission advantage based on legacy and weight placed on extracurricular non-academic credentials, which again is true but can't be quantified easily. Next slide. Students from different socioeconomic backgrounds with comparable scores receive similar grades in college. Well, their lines are a little bit off, quite frankly, but they reflect differences in freshman GPA after controlling for race, gender, family, income, first generation, legacy, etc. So higher SAT scores are associated with higher GPAs, even when comparing students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Students' performance on standardized entrance tests and their academic performance in college are very similar in these lines. You can see research has separately plotted the relationship of scores to grades for students attending less and more advanced more advantaged schools, and found no significant difference. Next slide. Finally, initial evidence from a symposium we did last year at the NCME with College Board and ACT looked at who's sending scores and who's not sending scores. And I'm sure some of this information may be more updated today. But students disclosing scores perform better in college than those who do not disclose their scores. So students who take the SAT or the ACT and send their scores do better in college than those who don't. This is certainly not causal, it's correlational at best. And it shows that those groups are different, quite different. Student scores, whether it takes curiosity relative to the college that they're applying to, are the best predictor of whether they will disclose the score or not. By that, I mean students who have above average scores, above average compared to the applicants applying to a school, are much more likely to report their scores. Students who score relative to applicants applying to a school, students' scores who tend to be lower or average may be more likely to not disclose them. So you look at the competition by resource books or test prep books or whatever, and you determine whether your score will be competitive or not. So same student who reports a 1300 to some colleges may be reluctant to report that 1300 to other colleges, but more selective. So that goes without saying. But they found what was very interesting. They found this did not differ by SES or ethnicity or gender. So they found that whether you're African American or female or white or Asian American or low income, high income, tended to follow the same patterns. In 2022, however, only 22% of test takers were from families earning less than 67,000 annually, which is a steep decline from what we found 6 years ago. So it does seem like lower income students are less likely to take the test and certainly less likely to report the scores. And so it may be a little bit more difficult to identify these students, but we're trying to find low income students who will be successful with our test scores. And I think that's part of the meaning. I've got some references here, and I've got some other slides on dependence if anybody's interested. With that, I'll stop and let Richard take over.
Okay, so, all right. Oh, I see. Let me see if I can get my notes back up. Okay. All right, so I have to pin myself again, I guess. Uh, okay, so I'm unmuted. Is Wayne still showing or am I showing?
I think you're showing, Richard.
Yeah, no, I've stopped sharing, sir.
So I'm showing. Okay, so all right. So it's Richard Phelps again, and I'm going to talk about the Regents. Even though I think in the end, I'm not sure that the Regents had a whole lot to do with the decision that is attributed to them. I invited over a dozen former Regents who had voted in the 2021 sessions to participate in this session. I wanted to learn what testing advocates might have done better to make their case to the Regents, but I received no positive responses to the invitations. So I'm just going to tell you what my impressions are after reading the minutes of the key meetings and reading some news stories about the Regents meetings held in 2021. So who were the University of California Board of Regents in 2021? 20 were appointed by a governor, 16 by Democratic governors, 4 by Republicans. 8 were represented alumni, faculty, and student organizations. 5 were ex officio state politicians, at that time all Democrats. Some of the appointees were very rich. Indeed, lavish spending on Regents' meals and creature comforts had aroused some controversy about the same time that the Regents decided to raise tuition and fees on the students. Most of the Regents seemed extremely well connected professionally. Like a lot of blue ribbon boards, it seems to me like they were fully busy with other endeavors with little, if any, extra time to delve into very deeply into university issues. The 20 appointees were mostly lawyers and MBAs involved in politics or business. The LA film industry was well represented. Silicon Valley was not. Demonstrating how times have changed, several decades ago, the Regents may have been overwhelmingly male WASP or white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. I don't believe there was a single male WASP among the over 30 members of the 2021 Regents. There were 15 men, 14 women. Like California, the Regents were a minority majority of Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans. Getting to the most important meeting in the spring of 2020, there was apparent overwhelming support for test blind from the public commentators, which included 4 high school students. I'm going to list the other organizations that were represented at this meeting, whose representatives spoke in favor of test blind. There was the president's, university president's Chicano Latino Advisory Council, someone from the Campaign for College Opportunity who claimed to represent 31 civil rights and education organizations, the Princeton Review Foundation, Beyond the Score, Southern California College Access Network, Inner City Struggle, Youth Programs at Community Coalition, the Dolores Huerta Foundation, Congregations Organized for Prophetic Engagement, Students Making a Change, Office of College Access and Completion, California League of United Latin American Citizens, Career Ladders Project, the UC Student Association, and the UC Graduate and Professional Council. An N of 19 spoke in favor. Against were 3 public commentators, one person who revealed no affiliation, another who was an owner of a test prep company, I think in Southern California, and our next speaker, Wenyuan Wu, who represented the Asian American Coalition for Education at the time. Almost all the public comments ignored the faculty report. The usual arguments against admission testing were offered: racist tests that discriminated against disadvantaged groups, inferior measure to others available, et cetera, et cetera. There was one different argument that I'd not heard before, and one of the Regents cited a trend away from SAT and ACT, claiming they were an outdated methodology and the Regents should get with the trend. A few Regents spoke up in support of the faculty study or mentioned some evidence in response to the criticisms, but in the end, all went along with Janet Napolitano, the university president at the time. She had drafted a test blind proposal in the few weeks before the meeting. Most of the 19 public commentators who spoke in favor endorsed her specific proposal. And in other words, this wide range of disparate groups have been made aware of the specific proposal in advance and were organized on very short notice to support it. Napolitano's proposal was presented as a compromise or as striking a balance because they would look into developing a different test. She dangled the possibility of a different test being developed, perhaps an adaptation of the SBAC, but that turned out to be a diversion and not a real possibility. Though at the time, it seemed to give a few regions who were leaning against Napolitano's proposal an excuse to support it. The regions would ultimately kill any prospect of developing their own admission test in a meeting less than a year later. Napolitano stated that she mostly agreed with the faculty, but then recommended a course of action 180 degrees different. Her proposal was, in her words, aligned with the faculty recommendations, but had some differences. According to the minutes, quote, "The president recommends that UC eliminate altogether its standardized testing requirement for admission for California students. This recommendation is based on the findings and recommendations of the Academic Senate's Standardized Testing Task Force, etc." Of course, it didn't at all align with the faculty recommendations. My impression is that the conclusion of the meeting had been decided beforehand, and her proposal was pretty much a steamroller. It was presented as if all had already been decided and everyone was in favor, and it would be easier all around if the regents would just go along. And they ended up passing her resolution unanimously. Indeed, the chair of the regents, according to the minutes, said afterwards, quote, "It was important that the university approach this question from a variety of perspectives, but in the end was unified. This represented the best of shared governance." A side note, the University of California markets their holistic admissions process. They openly advertise consulting services to other universities. Indeed, their years of experience trying to work around a ban on group preferences as part of their sales pitch, which leads to the wider context in which the test blind decision took place. California Proposition 209 was passed in the 1990s, and it banned group preferences by employers and education institutions. A new statewide Proposition 16 was proposed in 2020 to repeal Proposition 209 and thus reintroduce allowances for group preferences in hiring and admissions. In the summer of 2020, the regents voted in another meeting, again unanimously, to publicly support Proposition 16. The public comments at this regents meeting, 25 in favor, 0 opposed, 14 students, 7 professors, and 4 others spoke. Then later in the year, November of 2020, Californians as a whole voted on Proposition 16, 43% in favor, 57% opposed. Proponents had thought that California's changing demographics would work in their favor, and wide spectrums of the political and business establishment sided with them, almost unanimously. Proponents outspent opponents by a wide margin, but in the end, the minority-majority population of California again voted against allowing for group preferences in hiring and admissions. My general conclusion is that there's a disconnect between elite groups and the general population in California. And that's all for me. So I hand it over to Wanyuan Wu. Let's see, what do I need to do here? I guess Wanyuan, you start talking. I guess you'll be the focus. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
There you go.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you for hosting this important event. I'm glad to be here, and good afternoon to everyone. Dr. Kamara and Dr. Phelps mentioned Prop 209 and affirmative action in California. I was the executive director of the 2020 No on 16 campaign that defeated Prop 16. And I now work full-time raising public awareness on California's constitutional ban on racial preferences, not on affirmative action. Time permitting, I'd like to say a few words on this topic after giving my comments regarding UC's admissions policy changes. So I concur with Richard that the decision by UC Regents to drop standardized testing was a foregone conclusion before the voting procedures even started at both the 2020 and the 2021 Regents meetings. My opinion is informed by three things. Number one, my own witness account of these two meetings. Number two, my research on the ongoing war on tests in our higher education system. And number three, field experience in my line of work as a policy advocate in California. I'd like to talk about things together in my presentation. It's true, I testified against the test optional proposal at both the May 2020 and January 2021 UC Regents meetings. Even though I was only one of the few witnesses speaking in opposition to going test option, the scientific evidence supporting the test-free idea was at the time very scant, which was acknowledged by the Regents and the UC Academic Senate. However, the proposal to do away with SAT and ACT was couched in the political rhetoric of diversity, equity, and inclusion. For instance, at one of the three panels that presented at the May 2020 meeting, UC administrators, such as UCLA's Vice Provost for Enrollment, Yolanda Copeland Morgan, and UC Berkeley Chancellor, Carol Christ, made the case that using standardized tests in admissions exacerbated inequities and hurt student body diversity. This was purely disingenuous, given that the UC system has achieved more and more student body diversity over the last 2 decades under the testing system and under the perfectly legal need-based affirmative action landscape in the state under 209. UC admitted its most racially diverse undergraduate class in 2020. In fact, as of 2020, 6 of the 9 UC campuses were Hispanic serving institutions. The underrepresented minority enrollment system-wide increased from 15% in 1996 to 26% in 2019. The second panel at the 2020 meeting was a research and policy panel. Panelists disagreed about to which degree the Regents adopt the president's test optional proposal. UC San Diego professor of economics, Julian Betts, suggested amending the plan because SAT does not hurt diversity due to its circumstantial use within the system. Standardized testing was, according to this professor, contextualized in favor of low-income students. The other 3 experts, all of whom come from humanities and social sciences backgrounds, including the president of the California State Board of Education, Linda Darling Hammond, contested the task force's report and supported the president's plan to eliminate tests, at least temporarily, until a state alternative based on smarter balanced tests can be fleshed out. The last panel, consisting of members from the Academic Senate and the STTF, had the most rigorous and coherent arguments, in my opinion. Chair of the task force, UCSF pathology, Professor Henry Sanchez, summarized the group's year-long scientific analysis and the report's 8 actionable recommendations, which included not eliminating tests. Even the more left-leaning chair of the task force, an associate professor in education from UC Riverside, contended that even though most testing measures are affected by generations of, I quote, structural racism and other forms of oppression, unquote, standardized testing is not the culprit. Unfortunately, against many panelists' warning for caution and against empirical evidence, the Regents voted to abolish SAT and ACT, a decision which was reaffirmed in the 2021 meeting and made permanent after a lawsuit alleged that testing disadvantaged underrepresented minority students or applicants. Now, many of you may agree with me that UC's decision to get rid of testing was politically motivated. It was a fashion statement to appease the social justice warriors and a rubber stamp of approval for UC's equity-minded educrats. The UC case must be understood in the context of a national movement against tests and biological extension, the movement against merit. On one end, pundits argue that standardized tests have racist origins and are inherently inequitable. On the other hand, opponents say that testing is the most reliable predictor of student success, measured by college academic performance, graduation rates, and etc. Still, the vast majority in the middle propose that ACT and SAT scores should be considered among a host of other factors in the so-called holistic review process, which was pioneered by the Harvard University in the early 20th century for the ostensible purpose of limiting Jewish enrollment. There is a growing body of empirical studies researching the role of standardized testing through quantitative and qualitative methods. There is not a settled consensus, however, like most other inquiries in the social scientific world. In fact, as Charles Peirce once argued, scientific propositions are necessarily provisional because theoretical inquiry is too unsettled to be a good guide for practical decision-making. Instead, the art of thinking combining tradition, custom, and instinct may be a better guide. Nonetheless, a painful fact remains that as of today, according to the anti-test nonprofit National Center for Fair and Open Testing, over 19,000 accredited four-year colleges in the US have made standardized tests optional in their admissions processes, and 89 have gone completely test blind. The onslaught on tests, in spite of increasing empirical evidence showing the effectiveness of tests vis-a-vis other factors in admissions, is proof that most of our higher education institutions wholeheartedly buy into the racist tests narrative. The argument proffered by test blind proponents and advocacy groups that standardized tests impose unfair barriers to access higher education is a sweeping overgeneralization. There are many lines of reasoning against this notion. For one, even before the pandemic, a multitude of schools did not require testing for admissions. During the 2020-2021 academic year, 7 million or 33% of American undergraduate students were enrolled in two-year colleges that offer open access, which do not require testing. I can go on and on about the deep-root issue of K-12 learning gaps, which remains unresolved under test-free, and about the emerging issue of grade inflation. But I digress. The MIT has ranked ACT and SAT in its undergraduate admissions, followed by Dartmouth last week. Even the New York Times recently ran an article, an op-ed, praising values of standardized tests. Is the redress too late and too little? Only time will tell. I will just end my comments by saying that, in my humble opinion, getting rid of testing in the name of equity fundamentally attacks meritocracy and degrades the competitiveness of our higher education. The assault on merit also has feedback loops and unintended consequences in that it unfairly penalizes high-performing students who happen to not come from the so-called underrepresented minority backgrounds, many of whom may come from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, and they are penalized on the sole basis of race or ethnicity. That is antithetical to the American spirit and creed of equality. With that, I end my comments, and thanks again for having me.
Okay, so thank you. And I guess we'll open it up to questions. You can put your questions in the meeting chat. Let's see, let me scroll back to first question. Are there schools in California that don't calculate class rank? If so, how does that affect the admissions system? Does anybody know the answer to that?
Well, I'll speculate a little bit. I think I'm not positive, quite frankly, that UC still admits the top 9% of students based on class rank in California. Maybe someone else does that. But if they did, my understanding is that all the public schools would calculate class rank in order to get students in. Private schools are not part of that. So private or charter schools or out-of-state schools, they wouldn't be part of that formula. But UC did have the provision of admitting top 9% of students in class rank. And so I assume all public schools will do that if that policy has not changed. If you didn't do that, I'm sure you have parents, PTA on your doorstep tomorrow arguing that needs to issue class rank. So I can't imagine any public school would not issue class rank given that policy now, if it's still in effect.
I can also try to speculate or have a educated guess based on some anecdotal evidence. We've come into contact with, we've been contacted by some students from the Bay Area in the last 2 to 3 years, giving us evidence of being discriminated against in their journey, college application journey to the UC system. One student is, I believe, is from a top high school in Alameda County, California, in Northern California, and he was ranked top 5 among his entire class, graduating class. He applied to 5 UC campuses, including UCLA, UC Berkeley, UC Santa Barbara, UC San Diego. He was rejected by all of them. He claims that there is evidence of discrimination because he's Asian, but it could also be the case that he applied to a very hard to get in major, which is mechanical engineering. So we don't know, because right now UC has gone test optional since 2020, so we don't have the data on the correlation between these hard measurements of student performance, academic performance, and the admissions rate. But I don't think the UC, at least the UC, goes by class ranking. It depends on the major, and it also depends on the campus.
Okay, so are there other questions? Well, let's see. Okay, so Tony Albano says the only decent statistical result that I've seen raised by testing critics outside adverse impact comes from Saul Geiser, also Kurlander et al., where SAT is slightly more correlated with SES than GPA. Incremental validity controlling for SES in UC specifically. Geiser claims the faculty study downplayed this issue. So what are your thoughts? Wen-Yuan and Wayne?
Well, I'll just say the study that I'm familiar with, the guys who did a few years back, he loaded he looked at incremental validity in terms of SAT and grades, but he loaded the SAT2 and then the SAT1. And so I think he confounded the issue by doing that. He didn't really do a straight, fair analysis. So I think that was one of the issues we called him on. But I do think, quite frankly, that I don't know about UC, because this study really confounded them, and I think it was methodologically flawed. But I would say, from the research that I've seen, test scores generally are slightly more correlated with SES than grades, generally. That's been true for most studies that I've looked at. It's not a big difference, but it is a difference. So I would say that's true, but I don't think that that's ample reason to throw tests out. On the other hand, I do think that the test optional movement is not. I wouldn't criticize the university or school from trying it right now, but I do believe if they feel they can get a good class of high performance students and diversity with that method, they should be allowed to do it. But I do think tests have value, and it does change some of the ability to make informed decisions without more data.
Okay, so Adrian Solomon asks, is the category of underrepresented minority locally or nationally defined? Is it defined according to a particular legislation? That's the question.
Is it defined underrepresented students?
Yeah, is there
When we
like an official legal definition of who an underrepresented minority is?
I think you got to study separately, and even the task force analysis. I'm not sure the task force used the same definition for all their analyses. Some of them they used in-state students only. Some of them they used all opposites. But generally, not legally, but generally, when researchers look at underrepresented students, we're talking about ethnic groups outside of Asian Americans and white Caucasian students. Now, some may consider multi-ethnic, others may not. And usually they consider low-income students or first-generation college students sometimes. But again, these are just casual definitions that you got to look at the study for to really get the meaning if you want to be specific. I'm not familiar with the legal definition.
Okay,
According to the National Science Foundation, underrepresented minorities are races or ethnicities whose representation in said field, whether it is STEM employment or higher education, is smaller than their representation in the U.S. population. This generally includes Blacks or African Americans, Hispanics or Latinos, and American Indians or Alaska Natives. I think for the UC system in the undergraduate applications, these are self-identified categories. So the student has to choose whether or not he or she is of a certain race or ethnicity.
right. And more students are classifying themselves as multi-ethnic. I mean, that's been a trend in recent censuses. So it makes things more complicated. Okay. All right, so some statements, but I don't see more questions. Oh, all right, here we go. So James Steiger asks, Wayne's slides showing the relative effectiveness of test scores and high school GPA were not broken down by sex. Since boys underperform in high school classes relative to girls, it might seem that test scores would compensate for low GPA more for boys than for girls in gaining admission. Does anyone know if this is true?
Well, my recollection is that females are slightly more likely to be underpredicted by test scores. I'm sorry, underpredicted by test scores. Males a little bit overpredicted, and with grades it maybe not as big of an effect, but it's still an overprediction there about gender. I'm not sure if it gives an advantage or not. Quite frankly, however, it depends on the school and the numbers. But I do there is a little bit of overprediction. When I first broke into the field, gender differences were very important, and then quickly they didn't emerge as the most salient issues became ethnic and minority issues much more quickly than gender. So there hasn't been as much research on gender in the past 25 years as there was earlier.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's see. More statements, some very useful responses in the meeting chat to some of these questions. Okay, but let me get back to the last question. Yao Meng asks, in response to the question about Saul Geiser and Kurlander and whether SES and GPA incremental validity, he asks, why is this greater correlation a problem? Greater correlation, I suppose he's, oh, I see. What where SAT is slightly more correlated with SES than GPA. Why is that a problem? I suppose that's the question. He can clarify if he wants to.
Yeah, this is Tony Albano at UC Davis. I put a link to Geister's, one of Geister's papers in the chat. You know, the issue is really just that if it correlates more strongly with SES, specifically in our population, maybe we can get by without it.
Okay.
If GPA can do slightly better. That really is the only stat I've seen from critics that has, you know, some value to it, I think.
Okay, and somebody posted the link to the Geiser study.
This is Yao Meng.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. Oh, my question is really about, and I clarified it a little further down. This is often, a raised issue, that the correlation between SES and test scores, would best be controlled or eliminated. But it's only useful if you have the test scores, and then you can partial out that piece of information. And I suspect that the relationship between test scores and SES is not generally linear in the entire range. And it may be a very strong predictor, a good predictor in the high SES group, and it has no prediction only in the lower group, and that has implications on how you choose to use that information if you have access to them. Not having that information, though, to me is unnecessary handicapping, what you're trying to learn about the entire phenomenon. But if you want to go to a system where you don't want those test scores anymore, then you're necessarily, wishing to be blind, to what information that piece of type of information can bring to your understanding of the issues.
I agree that I think knowing that there's a correlation between SES and test scores, and it's a moderate correlation, and being aware of that, as admissions officers should help in terms of decisions. But there's a correlation between SES and grades, whether it's high school grades or college grades as well. And it's as much as we'd like to parcel out all the effects of what's due to books in the house, what's due to internet, what's due to social engineering, what's due to whatever we think of, it's going to be impossible to explain all of the variants in terms of SES and relationships to the education. But they are consistent that there are a relationship between SES and education outcomes, whether it's test scores or grades or persistence or graduation or what school you go to. And so those factors, I think you've got to be aware of them if you're an admissions officer, but I don't think it negates the value of tests at all, or the value of.
Okay, so next question, Sergio Araneda asks, what lessons can we take as a field from all the arc of test blindness on how to navigate technical argumentation in contexts that are driven by political views? Right, as the one Regent I referred to said, the trend is toward test blindness, but I'm not sure anymore. I mean, especially with the decisions recently made in the Ivy League and at MIT, maybe there's a backlash. But anybody else have Wen Yuan? What do you think?
It's a great question. Politics cannot leave higher education alone, right? And we have known this for a while. It's just being made more evident in the last few years. I think it needs a political problem needs a political solution, or political problems need political solutions. We need to continue to advocate for tests and for for merit, and that can be done through legal advocacy, that can be done through media outreach, that can be done through local organizing. So all channels of advocacy to push back the values and the emphasis on merit.
Okay.
I think in this country, you know, the question of merit has become you know, an unwelcome topic, you know, when raised in those forums. You know, but the fact that, you know, a place like MIT, and probably, you know, going to be true with all the very highly technical colleges, wanting a return to some of this testing is basically, you know, what they're trying to produce are people who can do the work, who can fly out, get our planes to fly, and things like that. Not a lot of time for they can't risk going down this path, you know, where yes, a lot of people will be very satisfied, you know, to see their kids in all these other schools, but there's a real danger, you know, when you know you try your best not to pay attention to the standards that will get us moving forward.
Part of the problem has been that higher ed hasn't communicated well enough, I don't believe, to the public about what they're looking for in students. The assumption from a lot of the public, maybe even the media, is that higher ed is looking for looking for students with the highest grades, the mediocrity. They're looking for merit, and I don't think that they're looking for it all. They're looking for students who will succeed, who will benefit, who will do well at school, but they're not looking for the top 1,000 applicants or top 2,000 applicants. They're looking for a diverse class. Diverse in terms of academic talents, in terms of interest, in terms of prior experiences, and in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, life experience. And so they're looking for students who will succeed. That's why UCLA is not going to be selecting many students who have an SAT score of 800 on two scales, or 400 on two scales, or students with GPAs below 3.8. That's what the data suggests. But I do believe that they're not looking for all the top performers either. They're looking for students who can really build a class together and bring interest and education experience to school. And I think parents who are sending kids to school, and the media and the public, doesn't really understand that message. And that's why we're at odds all the time. We're thinking, my student who got this score didn't get in, but your son or daughter got into the school with lower grades and SATs, and it has to have something to do. They're looking for an explanation. Is it race? Is it bias? Is it prejudice? And it may not be any of those. We're making determinations and judgments about people's lives with imperfect measures and imperfect information, and we're just trying to do the best we can. But I don't believe that any school is really looking for the most meritocratic students across the board. And I think we misunderstand that often, and we put values on schools, and that's what one of the problems with the court case about affirmative action. The folks assume that students with a particular grade or test score are entitled to be admitted, just like students who take up the best grades in graduate school are not entitled to be hired by ETF or ACT or LSAT either. I mean, you're looking for people who have a lot of different skills and a range of abilities, and the person most competent to multi-linear regression may not be the person you need on your psychometric team tomorrow.
Okay. So, are there any more questions? You might as well just speak up. I think if you still have a question, I think I've gotten to them all, but I'm not sure. If not, I guess we can wrap up. So, panelists, call it a day. I guess. All right. So let's end the meeting now. And thanks everybody for participating. I think it was a great session. And remember, 2 weeks from now, we're going to have another webinar on comparing internationally accountability systems. So thank you again, and have a good evening.